Hey folks, Matt here from SingleTracks. Today we're out reviewing the all-new GT Force. The GT released this new Force this summer and they revised it, adding the infamous high pivot and idler pulley system to their Horst suspension. So that is really the main difference about this new generation of GT Force. Still looks very similar to the previous version. There are some other differences in the frame, and we can go over those. But the main thing you're getting out of this revision, aside from more modern geometry, is that high pivot and idler pulley suspension. So this latest generation of the GT Force has 160 millimeters of rear travel, has a 170 millimeter fork, and it has 29-inch wheels exclusively. As mentioned, GT decided to put the high pivot on this Horst on this generation for a few reasons. One is that a few years ago they saw their athletes, say Martin Mays, the great Enduro racer, doing really well on the platform when he took home a downhill World Cup racing on the high pivot Fury. The GT released the Fury downhill bike a few years ago, summer of 2018, and they used a high pivot system with an idler pulley. And again, what they say is that they saw their athletes doing really well with the high pivot and thought that they would bring that same idea to an Enduro bike. So you're kind of getting this more downhill oriented suspension on something that you can pedal, and something that is obviously still going to see a lot of gravity use. Now, high pivots aren't new, but using them on bikes aside from downhill bikes and bikes aside from single pivot suspension platforms are relatively new. GT says that they combine the high pivot with the Horst for a few reasons, and that is aside from the athlete performance that they mentioned as well. By combining the Horst suspension that they've been using on the Force and putting a high pivot, what they can do is basically fine-tune the Horst to get the desired kinematics out of it, get pedaling support, raise the anti-squat, and they can also tune in a lot more mid-support. So speaking with GT's product manager, he mentioned that traditionally a lot of single pivot suspension platforms with the high pivot starts to feel a little bit dead in the middle of its travel. So by fine-tuning the kinematics on this GT Force, you can also get a high pivot bike that's going to feel really supportive while pedaling, and also supportive while you're descending, supportive while you're carving corners and dealing with compressions. And kind of the negatives when you're working with Enduro bikes and a lot of long travel bikes is that you're trying to increase the anti-squat, make it more pedalable, make it more of a climbing platform, because that's what Enduro riders and Enduro racers need. And the consequences of that are often pedal kickback. And then you also get a lot more chain growth when your suspension compresses. So what this means for the Force, boiled down, is that you get a bike that climbs really well, you get a bike that descends really well, and in theory, the suspension should feel a little bit more pure. The chain forces and the suspension forces are separated and they can act more independently of each other. And you don't have those negatives that are associated with chain growth on long travel bikes. So we have a lot more of this info on singletracks.com. If you really want to get into the weeds and read the finer details, then check out some of the articles we have by going to singletracks.com, going up in the top right, find the search bar, and search for high pivot or pedal kickback. And you'll find some articles that really go into a lot more depth explaining this. So a bit more about the Force. On this version, they did away with the external routing. They called it the groove tube. Now they call it tube and tube routing, or if you want to just call it what it is, it's internally routed cables. The Force now has a flip chip, very similar to how Rocky Mountain implemented their flip chip. It's in the chainstay at the axle, and so by flipping it you can add or subtract 10 millimeters of wheelbase or chainstay length. The C-tube angle has been increased to 78 degrees, the head tube angle has been decreased to 63.5 degrees. The reach on this medium is 455 millimeters. So I've been riding this Pro Carbon LE edition. It sells for $6,000. That's a carbon front triangle, aluminum rear triangle. And we'll go over the build details in a little bit, but right now let's get into the riding details. So as far as climbing the Force, all those marketing claims and all the kind of hyperbole they throw into the press release, this thing actually does feel very supportive when climbing and very responsive to pedaling input. I would love to try this bike with a different set of wheels, a set of carbon wheels, and it weighs in at 34.5 pounds, so you could stand to even drop a pound with a set of carbon wheels, but you'd also just get a much snappier climbing bike as well. But it really is a great sort of platform feel on this Force while you're pedaling it. feels very supportive, it's responsive to pedal input, and GT has done a good job of balancing that firmness in the suspension for climbing with traction. The geometry feels nice and upright. That seat tube angle is notably steep, and for mountains here in Colorado, I appreciated it because usually the trails I'm going to on a bike like this, the climb is just as steep as the descent, and that steep seat tube angle is great for climbs like that. So overall, the geometry feels great, the suspension feels great for climbing, and for a 34.5-pound bike, the Force carries its weight very well. All right, moving on to descending. I found that the Force, its longer front triangle, and basically just that modern geometry, like a lot of longer travel bikes, really calls for a forward and aggressive position to get the most out of it. But one of the better takeaways I had from riding the Force is that a lot of longer travel bikes like this, especially the ones that I've ridden in the past couple of years, they just feel like shred sleds. They are very good at going downhill fast, they're glued to the ground, and they have basically one thing in mind, getting from the top to the bottom as fast as possible. And a lot of those are characteristics that the Force has, but the Force feels a lot more playful, agile, and poppy than a lot of the long travel bikes I've ridden in recent years. The suspension, like GT claims, is very supportive. It deals with compressions well, it deals with carving corners well, and it keeps you sitting a lot higher in the travel. And this bike stays planted, but you also find mid-level support when you're trying to pop off of a root or a rock or launch a jump. It feels much more willing to get into the air and be flicked around than other bikes in this category. I think everybody wants to know how that high pivot suspension works, and I will say that it is a very noticeable difference compared to other Horst link long travel bikes. The Force feels really composed in chunky terrain, off drops, and notably at high speed chunky terrain. So say something like a trail in the bike park that combines a good deal of speed and throws in some rocks in there for good measure, where you're going 15, 20 miles an hour, but it's still a pretty natural trail where you need to watch your line. Trails like that are where the Force feels really, really good. The bike seems quieter, it seems more composed over those situations where you need to carry your speed over something really natural, a big long rock garden or a root bed, or those scenarios that combine natural features with speed. And the same over drops too. You really notice how quiet this bike is by eliminating that chain growth and the chain slap. Overall, just feels very, very composed over that kind of terrain. So we'll finish up with a few notes on the build kit and some of the components on this bike. As I mentioned, this is the Pro Carbon LE edition. This retails for $6,000, includes a carbon frame, aluminum chainstays, OEM GT branded cockpit, TranzX dropper post, but RockShox ultimate suspension Zeb fork, and a super deluxe rear shock. You also get a combination of GX Eagle and XO1 drivetrain parts, and then you get Code RSC brakes. Top of the line brakes from SRAM with a 220mm rotor up front and a 200mm rotor in back, which I really love. On bikes like this, I think the 220mm rotor is kind of a no-brainer. I just got an e-bike in for test and it has 200s front and rear, and I'm a little bit bummed that there's not a 220 on that one. The suspension also feels really good on this bike. It's fairly tunable, not that I really found I needed to tune this suspension a lot, but it feels great, and it's nice that you're basically getting top of the line suspension on this bike. Where I feel like the build kit suffers a little bit is in the dropper post remote, which just feels a little bit plasticky, and the ergonomics could be a lot better, especially on a bike that's $6,000. I was also not a big fan of the hub. It's a SRAM MTH rear hub. You get 21 points of engagement, so really just kind of a lousy amount of engagement for a bike that's $6,000. But other than that, I really enjoyed the build kit. I didn't have any problems with anything. Everything held up well. Again, great that you're getting basically top of the line suspension and brakes on a bike like this. It's definitely where you want a lot of that money to go. So overall, I will say the GT Force has been a great enduro bike. I've had a blast riding it. For something this capable, it still feels really agile, really playful, and really poppy. So that's it. Thanks for watching the review on the GT Force. If you have any questions on the bike, leave them in the comments and we'll do our best to get back to you with some answers. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more, subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you want to see more mountain bike news, as always, go to singletracks.com. We have new news and fresh content up every single day. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the trails.